The unspeakable things women endured in Comanche captivity. To understand what women endured in Comanche captivity, one must first abandon the image of the American frontier as a place of noble struggle or romantic escape. For the women taken by Comanche raiding parties between 1820 and 1875, the frontier was a geography of fear without borders. The Comanche, called Nermina, or the people, controlled a vast territory known as Comancheria, stretching from the Arkansas River in present-day Kansas and Colorado southward through the Texas Panhandle and Hill Country, all the way to the Edwards Plateau. Within this expanse of buffalo grass, mesquite thickets, and limestone canyons, no white settlement, no stockade, no cavalry patrol could guarantee safety. The raiding itself followed seasonal patterns, increasing in late summer and autumn when Comanche horses were fat from spring grass and young warriors sought both glory and plunder. Ranches, trading posts, stagecoach stations, and isolated farmsteads in Texas and northern Mexico presented irresistible targets. Survivors' accounts describe the same terrifying sequence: a distant cloud of dust, then the drumming of hooves, then the screaming, not yet of pain, but of warning. Women gathered children, men reached for rifles, but the raiders were almost always faster. The first unspeakable thing, witnessing. For a woman taken alive, the first unspeakable horror was not what happened to her own body but what she was forced to watch happen to others. Comanche war parties did not typically massacre entire settlements. They wanted captives, horses, and goods, but they made certain that the women they seized would never forget the price of resistance. Husbands who fired a second shot were killed on the spot, often with knives to conserve ammunition. Older children who ran were ridden down and clubbed. Infants who cried during the swift sorting of prisoners, those to keep, those to kill, those to leave, were sometimes taken from mothers' arms and dashed against stones or wagon wheels. This was not indiscriminate cruelty. It was calculated terror. A woman who had watched her baby die before her eyes, who had seen her husband scalped or her teenage daughter violated, was less likely to attempt escape in the first weeks of captivity. Her will had already been broken before she ever mounted a horse. Rachel Plummer, taken in May 1836 near the Upper Brazos River, described this process in the narrative she later dictated after her ransom. She saw her 2-year-old son, James Pratt Plummer, pulled from her arms and given to a warrior who rode away with the child slung over his saddle like a sack of meal. She did not know if he was alive or dead. She then watched as another warrior raped her sister-in-law, Martha, on the ground beside the still smoldering ruins of their cabin. Rachel herself was beaten with a quirt, a braided leather whip, when she tried to cover Martha's body with her own. By the time the raiding party began the long ride back into Comancheria, Rachel had already stopped crying. The warriors noted this with approval. A quiet captive was a manageable one. The forced march into the unknown. The journey into captivity was a second layer of trauma. Women were made to walk barefoot across thorn-scattered plains while warriors rode. Those who lagged were dragged by ropes tied around their wrists or necks. Those who fell were kicked until they rose. Water was given sparingly, a few swallows from a parfleche bag, and food almost never during the first days. Some women were stripped of their dresses and given only a thin blanket or a piece of hide to wear. Others were made to ride naked, their skin blistering under the high plains sun, their thighs raw from gripping a horse's bare back. The psychological disorientation was as brutal as the physical. The Comanche did not speak English or Spanish to their captives. They spoke in sharp, guttural commands accompanied by gestures, a pointed knife, a raised hand, a thumb jabbed toward the ground. Women who could not understand were beaten until they learned to interpret tone and posture. At night, the party would stop in a dry creek bed or at the base of a bluff. The women were tied by their wrists to a rope stretched between two horses or to a heavy stake driven into the ground. They slept in their own filth. If a warrior approached one of them in the darkness, the others learned to look away. There was no intervention. Any woman who cried out or tried to pull the warrior off her captive companion was beaten into silence. The raiders understood something that captivity narratives would later obscure, that forcing women to witness each other's violation was a form of communal shattering. After a few nights on the trail, no woman trusted any other. Each believed that her survival depended on being less noticeable, less troublesome, less tempting to the men who held the ropes. The sorting. When the raiding party reached its home village, a collection of conical teepees arranged in a great circle on a river bottom, the real captivity began. The prisoners were driven through the camp like cattle, and the entire village turned out to see them. Children threw stones. Women barked like dogs, a traditional expression of contempt for enemies. Old men poked the captives with sticks and laughed at their weeping. This public humiliation served several purposes. It reinforced the captive status as property, not persons. It allowed the band to vent collective aggression on safe targets. And it announced to the warriors that they had done their duty in bringing home plunder. The sorting of captives followed a rough hierarchy. Young children, especially those under the age of 5 or 6, were often taken immediately by Comanche women who had lost their own children to disease or raid. These children were washed, dressed in hide clothing, given new names, and told that their old lives were forgotten. For the mothers who watched this happen, the loss was a second death. Some children, like Cynthia and Parker taken in 1836 at age 9, eventually assimilated so completely that they refused to return to white society. But their mothers did not know that. They knew only that their sons and daughters were being led away by strangers who spoke a language they could not understand. Older children, girls approaching puberty and boys old enough to work, were assigned to specific families as laborers. Girls hauled water, scraped buffalo hides, gathered firewood, and helped dismantle teepees during moves. Boys herded horses, learned to shoot small game, and were eventually trained as warriors. These children were beaten frequently but not usually subjected to the same sexual violence as adult women. That would come later for the girls. Adult women, however, entered a different and darker category. They were considered property to be used, traded, or ransomed as the band saw fit. Some were given immediately to the warriors who had captured them, becoming what contemporary writers euphemistically called wives, but what the women themselves described as repeated rape without the possibility of refusal. Others were assigned to the oldest or most influential women of the band, the matriarchs who controlled hide working, cooking, and the distribution of domestic labor. These assignments were not acts of mercy. Comanche matriarchs could be as cruel as any warrior, forcing captives to work from dawn until long after dark, withholding food, and administering public beatings for perceived laziness or disrespect. A captive who belonged to a matriarch was less likely to be sexually assaulted by warriors, because her labor was too valuable to risk pregnancy or injury, but she was also less likely to be ransomed quickly. The matriarchs needed their slaves. The third unspeakable thing, the body as battlefield. It is impossible to write honestly about Comanche captivity without describing the sexual violence at its core. Historians have sometimes softened this reality by noting that Comanche culture did not stigmatize premarital or extramarital sex in the same way that Euro-American culture did, or that some captive women eventually chose to remain with their captors. Both statements contain fragments of truth, but neither addresses the central fact. The vast majority of adult women taken captive were raped repeatedly, often by multiple men, and had no meaningful choice in the matter. The Comanche conceptualized captives as spoils of war. A warrior who seized a woman had the right to use her body as he wished. If other warriors wanted access to her, they could offer horses, blankets, or other goods to her owner. Women were sometimes passed between men in a single night, each warrior taking his turn before returning the captive to her rope or her sleeping place. Contraception and abortion were known to the Comanche. They used herbal preparations made from roots and berries, but these were not reliably available to captives, who were often denied access to medicinal knowledge. Many captive women became pregnant within weeks of their capture. Some were forced to bear children who were then taken from them at birth and raised as Comanche. Others miscarried from malnutrition, disease, or beatings. A few found ways to end their own pregnancies, though captivity narratives rarely describe how. The physical injuries from repeated rape were severe and lasting. Women suffered lacerations, infections, prolapses, and chronic pain. Some developed fistulas, tears between the vagina and bladder or rectum, that left them incontinent and reeking, which in turn made them even more despised by their captors. Medical care was rudimentary. Comanche healers could set broken bones and treat arrow wounds with poultices of buffalo fat and herbs, but they had no effective treatments for internal injuries or venereal disease. Captive women who became too sick to work were sometimes killed or simply left behind when the band moved camp. A woman who could not walk or ride was worthless. Adaptation as survival. Not every captive woman was broken. Some learned to navigate Comanche society with a cunning that kept them alive long enough to be ransomed or to escape. These women discovered that compliance was not the same as submission. They learned enough of the Comanche language to plead for mercy, to bargain for better tasks, to identify which warriors were most likely to protect them from others. They cultivated the favor of influential women by working harder than anyone expected, by praising their captors' children, by never crying in public. They memorized the geography of Comancheria, the rivers, the mountain passes, the direction of the rising sun, against the day they might run. But adaptation came at a cost that could never be fully repaid. A woman who smiled at her captor, who bore his children without protest, who cooked his meals and scraped his hides, was often accused after her rescue of having gone native. Family members who had prayed for her return sometimes turned cold when they saw her wearing buckskin, speaking a few words of Comanche, or refusing to look her rescuers in the eye. She had survived, but survival had required her to become someone else. The woman who had been taken no longer existed. In her place was a stranger who flinched at loud noises, who woke screaming from dreams she could not describe, who could not bear to be touched by her own husband. The unspeakable things she had endured in captivity did not end when the gates of the fort closed behind her. They followed her home. The question of ransom. Ransom was the stated goal of many captivities. Comanche bands frequently allowed traders, missionaries, or Mexican officials to buy back white captives for a price: horses, blankets, rifles, beads, whiskey. But ransom was rarely simple. A band might promise to release a woman for 20 horses, then raise the price to 30 when the negotiators arrived. They might return a woman missing her ears or her nose as a warning to others who might try to negotiate from weakness. They might refuse to ransom a woman who had become pregnant by a Comanche warrior, because the child was considered Comanche and the mother was needed to nurse it. Some women waited years for ransom, watching younger, prettier, or more valuable captives go free while they remained. The ransom process itself was a final humiliation. Women were usually stripped and examined by male traders to ensure they were not diseased or injured beyond usefulness. They were sometimes paraded through settlements as proof that the band had kept its word. And when they were finally handed over, often naked, often weeping, often unable to walk, they discovered that the white world they had dreamed of for years had changed. Their husbands had remarried. Their children had grown up without them. Their neighbors whispered that no decent woman would have survived captivity unless she had cooperated with her captors. The unspeakable things were not spoken. They were not even acknowledged. The women were expected to be grateful for their rescue and silent about everything that had happened before it. The architecture of a captive's day. To be a captive woman in a Comanche camp was to inhabit a parallel universe where the ordinary rhythms of life, dawn, meal preparation, child rearing, sleep, became instruments of torment. The typical Comanche day began before sunrise, when the oldest woman of the teepee struck a piece of iron against a flint to spark the morning fire. For a captive, this sound was not a gentle awakening but a summons to labor that would not end until long after dark. Her first task was water. She would walk, never run, never dawdle, to the nearest river or creek, carrying a folded buffalo paunch or a clay jar on her head or shoulder. The distance might be a quarter-mile or more. If she spilled water on the return trip, she would be beaten with a stick or a quirt. If she took too long, she would be beaten harder. If she tried to drink more than a few swallows for herself, she would be beaten and forced to go again. Some captive women described drinking from puddles or from the hoofprints of horses rather than risk angering their captors by taking water meant for the teepee. After water came firewood. The Comanche burned through enormous quantities of wood, for cooking, for warmth, for smoking hides, for ceremonial fires. Captive women gathered deadfall, broke branches over their knees, and carried bundles twice their size back to camp. The work was hard on hands already raw from scraping hides and from the chafing of ropes. Splinters festered. Cuts from flint knives became infected. A woman who could not keep up with the other gatherers was left behind to face her owner's wrath in the evening. The central labor of a captive's life, however, was hide scraping. Buffalo hides were the currency of Comanche wealth. A single robe could be traded for horses, guns, or food. The process of turning a fresh hide into a soft, pliable robe or a stiff parfleche container required days of work. First, the hide was stretched on the ground with wooden pegs. Then a woman knelt at its edge and began scraping away the fat and connective tissue with a tool made of elk antler or iron. The scraping motion, pull, scrape, went on for hours. The woman's arms ached, her knees grew raw, her back spasmed. If the hide was not clean enough, the Comanche matriarch who supervised the work would run her hand over the surface and point to the missed spots. The captive would scrape again. And again. If a captive woman was owned by a warrior of high status, she might be required to scrape 20 or 30 hides in a single season. The work was done outside, in full sun or cold wind, with no protection for her hands or face. The stench of rotting flesh clung to her clothing and skin. The blood and grease from the hides soaked into her cracked hands and never fully washed out. Other Comanche women, free women, married women, women who had never known captivity, worked alongside her, but they worked at their own pace. They could stop to nurse a child or to gossip with a neighbor. They could eat when they were hungry. The captive could not. Hunger as a weapon. Food was never abundant in a Comanche camp. The band's diet depended on the success of the hunt and the season. During the summer buffalo runs, there was meat, fresh liver eaten raw, tongue boiled in a paunch, hump ribs roasted over coals. During the winter, when the herds moved south, there was less. Captive women ate last and least. They were given the scraps that fell from the cooking paunch, bits of gristle, half-raw organs, bones that had been picked clean by Comanche children. If the band was starving, the captives starved faster. Some women described going days without food, their bellies swollen from drinking muddy water, their hair falling out, their teeth loosening in their gums. But hunger was not just a consequence of scarcity. It was a deliberate tool of control. A well-fed captive might have the strength to run. A hungry captive could barely stand. The Comanche understood this calculus perfectly. They did not starve their captives to death, that would be wasteful, but they kept them perpetually at the edge of weakness. A captive woman who worked hard might be rewarded with an extra handful of dried berries or a strip of jerky. A captive who complained or attempted escape might be fed nothing but boiled hide glue for a week. The glue would keep her alive. It would not keep her strong. The child question. Perhaps no aspect of Comanche captivity is more difficult to confront than the treatment of children born to captive women. These children, half white, half Comanche in the eyes of both cultures, occupied a liminal space that offered neither the protection of kinship nor the hope of ransom. A captive woman who became pregnant by her captor faced an impossible set of choices. If she carried the child to term and delivered it in the camp, the baby would almost certainly be taken from her immediately. Comanche custom held that children belonged to the father's band. A child born to a captive mother was considered fully Comanche, not a captive at all. The mother might be allowed to nurse the infant for a few weeks, if her milk was good, if the child was healthy, but then the baby would be given to a Comanche woman to raise. The mother might see the child occasionally, playing with other children in the camp. She might even be allowed to hold it. But she would not be its mother. She was, in the eyes of the band, merely the vessel that had carried it. Some captive women tried to prevent pregnancy by using herbal abortifacients, if they could obtain them. Others attempted to induce miscarriage through physical means, jumping from rocks, pressing on their bellies, drinking large quantities of salty water. These attempts were dangerous and often unsuccessful. A woman who succeeded in aborting a pregnancy risked being killed if discovered. The Comanche valued children above almost everything else. To destroy a pregnancy was to destroy potential warriors, potential traders, potential future leaders of the band. It was an act of profound transgression. Other women chose to embrace their children, whatever the cost. They loved the babies who were taken from them. They watched from a distance as those babies learned to walk and speak Comanche. They mourned in silence when a child died of fever or a fall from a horse. And when they were finally ransomed or rescued, they faced the most terrible choice of all: to leave their Comanche children behind or to take them into a white world that would never accept them. Most left them behind. The children were Comanche now. To take them away would be to subject them to the same captivity their mothers had endured, but in reverse. A few women refused to leave without their children. Those children, if they were young enough, sometimes adapted to white society. But they never forgot the camp. They never forgot that they had once belonged to two worlds and been fully accepted by neither. Torture as public spectacle. The Comanche did not torture captives for information. They tortured them for power. The act of inflicting pain on a helpless person, especially a person of another race, another culture, another world, was a way of demonstrating the band's dominance over all that lay beyond Comancheria. Torture was also entertainment. On nights when the hunt had failed or the winter winds kept everyone inside, the band might bring out a captive who had attempted to escape or who had committed some other infraction. The torture would begin at dusk and continue until the captive died or the torturers grew bored. The methods were various and horrifying. Captives were burned with heated arrowheads pressed into their skin. They were tied between two horses and pulled apart slowly. They had their fingernails pulled out with pliers taken from a raid. They were forced to run naked through a gauntlet of warriors, armed with sticks and quirts. They were scalped while still alive, then forced to watch as their own hair was waved in their faces. Women who had been captured with their husbands were sometimes forced to watch their husbands die in these ways before enduring the same themselves. The purpose of torture was not just to kill but to prolong death, to make it a process rather than an event. A woman who was being tortured was expected to sing her own death song, a traditional Comanche practice for warriors facing death. If she did not know the song, she was expected to endure her pain in silence. Crying, begging, or screaming for mercy was seen as cowardly. It did not stop the torture. It only made it worse. Not all captives were tortured. Most were too valuable as labors to be wasted in this way. But those who attempted escape, or who were suspected of plotting escape, or who simply fell into the disfavor of a powerful warrior, could find themselves at the center of a torture circle with no warning and no hope of rescue. The memory of those nights, the firelight, the laughter, the smell of burning flesh, stayed with the survivors who watched from the edges of the circle, knowing that they might be next. Escape and its price. Escape was the dream that kept some captive women alive. They studied the camp's layout, memorized the guard routines, noted which horses were fastest and which warriors slept most soundly. They gathered small supplies, dried meat, a flint, a knife, and hid them in the brush outside the camp. They waited for the right moment, a moonless night, a rainstorm that would cover their tracks, a buffalo hunt that took most of the warriors far from the village. But escape was almost always a death sentence. Comancheria was hundreds of miles wide. A woman on foot, alone, without food or water, had no realistic chance of reaching a white settlement before she was recaptured or died of exposure. The Comanche who found her, and they almost always found her, tracking her with a skill that seemed supernatural, would kill her slowly. Sometimes they would cut off her feet so she could never run again. Sometimes they would cut off her nose and ears so she would be marked forever as an escapee. Sometimes they would simply shoot her and leave her body for the coyotes, as a message to other captives. And yet women escaped. Not many, but some. They escaped by stealing horses and riding through the night. They escaped by hiding in river bottoms and moving only at dusk. They escaped by walking for weeks on bloody feet, eating insects and raw fish, drinking from puddles, sleeping in hollow logs. When they finally stumbled into a settlement, a trading post, a mission, a cavalry outpost, they were often too weak to speak. They had to be carried inside. Their rescuers saw their scars, their missing fingers, their branded skin. They saw what the Comanche had done. But they did not ask. And the women did not tell. The rescued body. Rescue was not the end of suffering. It was a different kind of suffering, quieter but no less profound. The women who were ransomed or who escaped found themselves in a world that had no language for what they had endured. Doctors examined their bodies for disease but not for trauma. Priests asked if they had been baptized. Families embraced them and then stepped back, unsure how to touch someone who had lived among the enemy. The physical marks of captivity could not be hidden. A woman who had been forced to scrape hides for years had calluses on her knees and hands that would never soften. A woman who had been branded had a scar that she covered with long sleeves even in summer. A woman who had been raped repeatedly might have given birth to children she would never see again. Her body remembered everything. It remembered the weight of the warrior, the smell of the hide smoke, the taste of hunger. It remembered the nights when she had prayed for death and death had not come. Some rescued women recovered. They remarried, had more children, lived long lives in quiet obscurity. Others did not. They withdrew from society, refusing to leave their homes, refusing to speak to anyone except their closest relatives. They developed tics and tremors. They started at loud noises. They could not sleep without a knife under their pillow. They were called crazy, hysterical, broken. They were not broken. They were surviving. They had always been surviving. The only difference was that now they had to survive without the structure of captivity, without the clear enemy, without the daily fight, without the hope of ransom that had sustained them through years of horror. Freedom was its own kind of prison. The silence of the records. One of the most striking features of the historical record is how little it contains about the experiences of captive women. The captivity narratives that survive, Rachel Plummer's, Sarah and Horn's, Fanny Hensley's, were heavily edited by male publishers who removed anything too graphic or too shameful. The narratives that were never written are the true archive of Comanche captivity. They exist in the bodies of the women who survived, in the stories they whispered to their daughters, in the silences they maintained until the day they died. The Comanche themselves left no written records of their treatment of captives. They did not need to. They knew what they had done. The women who had been taken knew what had been done to them. The unspeakable was unspeakable precisely because it could not be contained in words. It could only be lived. And then it could only be buried. But burying is not the same as erasing. The truth of Comanche captivity persists in the land itself, in the river bottoms where women gathered water, in the canyons where they tried to hide, in the plains where they walked barefoot toward a freedom they could barely imagine. The wind still carries their silence. The grass still grows over their footprints. And if we listen carefully, if we read between the lines of the edited narratives, if we look at the scars on the hands of the women who came home, we can begin to hear what they could not say. They endured. That is the only word that fits. They endured the taking, the march, the rape, the labor, the hunger, the torture, the loss of their children, the loss of themselves. They endured rescue and its aftermath. They endured silence. And now, more than a century later, we who read their stories must endure the weight of knowing. We must not look away. We must not soften what they suffered. We must not pretend that the unspeakable can be made speakable by euphemism or omission. We must simply witness. That is all they ever asked. That is the least we can do.